This year, Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Day, known in Israel as Yom HaShoah, began at sundown on Wednesday, April 7th, and ended at sundown on the following day. In Israel, it falls on the 27th day of the month of Nisan, and thus lands on different dates in the U.S. from year to year. On this date, we commemorate those who participated in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and, for several weeks and against all odds, fended off the Nazis' attempts to deport and murder them. In Israel, on the morning of Yom HaShoah, a siren is sounded for 2 minutes throughout the country, and all work and other activity stops while people remember and honor all those who died in the Holocaust. The Holocaust Education and Awareness Commission, whose mission is to promote Holocaust education and awareness throughout the state in order to broaden understanding and discourage bigotry, understands that we must learn from the past so we do not repeat it. Learning from the past means strongly condemning anti-Semitism, as well as intolerance in all forms and any variety of Holocaust denial. As is widely known, acts of anti-Semitism continue to occur. It has been documented that they are on the rise. One hears and reads of them even within the state of Missouri. The Holocaust Education and Awareness Commission condemns acts of intolerance against anyone and asks for the people of Missouri to condemn them as well. Just as neighbors can harm neighbors, neighbors can also stand with neighbors, working to help one another and to improve one another's lives. The Holocaust happened. It was among the defining events of the 20th century. There are still survivors who recall it, and we must hear their stories and learn from them. Listening to survivors, learning from the mistakes of the past, and respectfully looking out for one another's well-being are steps that each of us can take to ensure the Holocaust never happens again.
Hello, I'm Rabbi Brigida Rosenberg from United Hebrew Congregation, and our Holocaust scroll is from Czechoslovakia. We don't know its exact origins. However, every year in May, we honor our Torah scroll as we remember the lost Jewish community of Humana, Czechoslovakia.
Shalom. My name is Randy Fleischer, and I'm one of the rabbis at Central Reformed Congregation in the city of St. Louis. And this is our scroll. This Torah comes from a village in Czechoslovakia called Halisov. In Halisov, while this Torah survived, tragically, none of the Jews who lived in that village survived the Shoah. And so it is a privilege and a blessing for us to have this scroll. And the primary way that we use it is when we have a young person become bar or bat mitzvah in our community. Their grandparents and parents and the student themselves line up at the bima, and we pass this Torah, as we say, lador vador, from generation to generation into the student's arms. And we tell them that by holding this Torah, they know that there's not only great joy in passing the values and traditions of Torah through the generations, but there is also a great responsibility that this Torah survived and we survive in order to spread the values and messages of Judaism.
I'm Rabbi Jim Bennett of Congregation Sheremeth, and I'm privileged to hold in my arms scroll number 935 of the Czech Memorial Holocaust Trust. This scroll has lived within Congregation Sheremeth since 1974, and we have been privileged to include it in sacred moments within the life of our congregation, such as the bar bat mitzvah ceremonies of children and grandchildren and now great-grandchildren of survivors of the Shoah. The scroll reminds us of the power of memory, but also of the power of hope.
Shalom. My name is Rabbi Michael Alper, and I am the grandson of Holocaust survivor Morris Scharfing. It's a privilege to join you today as I hold this sacred scroll entrusted to our congregation, Congregation Temple Israel. This Torah is a living scroll that is used throughout the year on sacred occasions of life cycle, such as bar and bat mitzvah, on chagim, such as Simchat Torah, where we take it out and we dance with it, on sacred occasions such as this one, where we take it out and sometimes weep over it. This Torah, more than anything though, serves as a powerful symbol, a reminder that we shall not forget what has happened, and we shall teach the virtues of goodness and righteousness to all the generations that are yet to come.
Hello, I'm Rabbi Noah Arno, a rabbi of Kolrina. We are so grateful to have two Sifrei Torah from the Shoah. They are tangible reminders to us of a civilization that no longer exists, but they also remind us that we are inheritors of an amazing, beautiful, wise tradition.
Shalom. I am Rabbi Neil Rose of Congregation B'nai Emunah. This Sefer Torah was gifted to us a number of years ago. It comes someplace from Czechoslovakia. We're not too sure exactly where, but it is our great blessing to have it. Each time I hold a Torah, I sense the presence of the people who read from it. More specifically, their DNA. As you may know, each time a Jew is called to the Torah, he kisses the Torah. That means that each Jew, probably over 100 years, has kissed this Torah. The only place that these people are alive is in this Torah, and it is my honor to be their messenger.
Hello, I am Rabbi Elizabeth Hirsch from Temple Emmanuel, and I humbly hold our Torah scroll that is from Trebin, Czechoslovakia. The community there dates back to the 12th century, housing about 9,000 members of the community. There were 87 Jewish members of the community who were deported in 1939, never to return. Our sacred scroll is used at Temple Emmanuel in the same rotation as the other 5 scrolls. We find it holy by using it on Yom Kippur afternoon and every time we take it out to read. Our Torah scroll has some blood on it. It also has a repaired bullet hole. But I know that the members of Trebin, Czechoslovakia live on with each word that is read, with each celebration, with each Amen. We continue to go from strength to strength.
Shalom, my name is Rabbi Carney Rose, and it is my honor to serve as the Senior Rabbi of Congregation B'nai Emunah. B'nai Emunah is the virtual venue for this important program, and we welcome you. Today we are commemorating Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura. As many of you know, on April 12, 1951, the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, proclaimed Yom HaShoah to be a day that will be remembered on the 27th of the Hebrew month of Nisan. And so we gather now to remember not only the destruction, but also the heroism. The 27th of Nisan is a day when Jews throughout the world recall formally the 6 million members of our family who perished in Europe during the time known as the Great Shoah. Countless memoirs and diaries have been written about the brutalization and the murder of our people. We recall part of what transpired, and in that way we become edim, we become witnesses to those terrible events. On this day, and not only on this day, we do our best to remember and perpetuate the testimony of those who survived, of those who did not survive, of those who will never forget. Nobody will want to believe us because our disaster is the disaster of the entire civilized world. We will have the thankless job of proving to a reluctant world that these events transpired. We are Abel, murdered by our brother. These are the words of a man by the name of Ignacy Schipper, who perished in Majdanek. There is no adequate response to the Shoah, but we must not ignore it, and therefore we must remember, we must recall, we must speak out.
Good afternoon. I'm Brian Herstig, President and CEO of the Jewish Federation of St. Louis. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Last year, as many of you know, we canceled our annual commemoration of Yom HaShoah as we dealt with the early days of the pandemic. This year, our St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum is grateful to be able to join with you to remember those who perished as well as those who survived and who continue to inspire us to build a better world. Never does that purpose resonate more strongly than on this day, Yom HaShoah. 70 years ago today, when the first Yom HaShoah commemorations took place, the full scope of horrors of the Holocaust were barely beginning to be understood. As we gather virtually today, we recognize that future generations will be tasked with sharing and reframing those lessons so they are never forgotten. Sadly, we recognize that these lessons have not yet been fully learned. Anti-Semitic incidents are on the rise at an alarming rate, and violence directed at ethnic and religious groups has been occurring with disturbing frequency. Yom HaShoah calls on all of us to fulfill the duty of tikkun olam, repairing the world, by preserving the memories of those who lived through the Shoah and by listening to all of the survivors, those who rebuilt new lives in St. Louis, and survivors everywhere who share their testimonies, however painful, to fulfill this goal. We must all play a role by listening to their words, internalizing them, and acting on them. As Elie Wiesel wrote, to listen to a witness is to become a witness. Now, please join me in welcoming Don Hannon, Acting Director of the museum.
Good afternoon. As Acting Director of the Holocaust Museum, it is my honor to speak with you on this important day. Last year, as ground was broken on the new museum and its new name, the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum, was announced, a special message was added and became part of its name, in honor of the survivors and the memory of the victims. This has been central to the museum's mission for the past 25 years, and will continue to be its vision when the new museum opens in the summer of 2022. For over 25 years, the Holocaust Museum has organized this annual community-wide Holocaust commemoration, always with the support of Leo and Sara Wolf of blessed memory and the Wolf family. Whether it be at the state capitol, a local place of worship, or virtually, we will continue to gather together to draw inspiration from the lessons of courage, compassion, and resilience of our St. Louis survivors and witnesses. Now please welcome the museum's curator and director of education, Dan Rich.
Good afternoon. We gather together to commemorate Yom HaShoah, the most important program presented by the St. Louis Kaplan Feldman Holocaust Museum. We look forward to welcoming you at our newly expanded Holocaust Museum in summer 2022. In the meantime, please check out our website for virtual tours and information about other education programs. For much of our educational outreach and support of the new building, I want to thank Gloria Feldman, her husband Reuben of blessed memory, and the next generation of her family. The shofar blasts we heard call us to attention and also call us to action, to listen and heed the voices we are about to hear. We have seen the St. Louis community's Holocaust Torah scrolls, silent witnesses to the destruction of European Jewry. Later, we will light memorial candles and hear liturgical readings and prayers. We will also hear from our 3 Shimshanim, young Israelis who defer military service for 1 year and serve as emissaries to Jewish communities abroad. First, we will honor the voices of our survivors. Books and films can give us the facts about the Holocaust, but the voice of the survivor is the most effective way to transmit the essence of this history. We thank all of the survivors in our community who have shared their stories. In the late 1970s, under the direction of Vida, Sister Prince, the Holocaust Museum began the systematic gathering and recording of testimonies by local survivors and witnesses. The fruits of this ongoing project can be found on the museum's website under Survivor Stories. Today, we'll be hearing the testimony of 2 survivors, Erika Schwartz, a survivor from Hungary, and Oscar Jacob, a survivor from Romania.
I was born Erika Hornstein on April 23, 1944, in a Hungarian ghetto, just 1 day before the ghetto was sealed by the Nazis and just 2 weeks before transport to Auschwitz began. My mother, Yolan Petrover, was born in the town of Hajdú-Shamshin. Until her mid-teens, she lived in that small town, surrounded by grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. The entire family lived within walking distance of each other. She had 2 sisters, Margit and Olga, and 2 brothers, Avram and Yena. In 1938, the Hungarian government passed laws restricting Jewish participation in ordinary day-to-day life. Many Jewish families were forced to abandon their homes. My mother's family was forced from their home and moved to the city of Nyíregyháza. Although Hungarian Jews initially felt insulated from the brutality of the Nazis, life changed drastically when the government began to round up all the able-bodied Jewish men and imprison them in forced labor camps. My parents were married less than 2 years before my father was taken into forced labor. Shortly afterward, my mother learned that she was pregnant. Afraid to be alone, she left their Budapest apartment and moved in with her mother in Nyíregyháza. On March 19, 1944, Nazis occupied the town. By April 17th, they had completed the construction of the ghetto. On April 24th, the ghetto was sealed. Preparations had begun to transport the Jews to Auschwitz. Because my grandparents' home was within the boundaries of the ghetto, All of my mother's remaining female relatives and their children were now living in the house. The men had long before been taken into forced labor or had been rounded up and shot, as was my grandfather. I was born on April 23, 1944, in the ghetto, just one day before it was sealed. On May 12th, the deportations to Auschwitz began. By then, my mother and I were no longer there, but I'll tell you about that in a moment. All of the women and children who remained in my grandparents' house were transported by cattle car to Auschwitz. On the day they arrived, my great-grandmother Dina, my grandmother Honey, 3 little cousins, Mickey, age 9, Imre, age 7, and Joji, age 2, were murdered in the gas chamber. My mother's older sister Margit and her sister-in-law Clara were the only ones who survived the initial selections. Upon disembarking from the cattle car, they were convinced to turn the small children over to my grandmother, not knowing that they were sending their children to their deaths. Because of this, they were selected for slave labor in Auschwitz. Clara, my mother's sister-in-law, survived the war. She was the one who eventually told my mother how her sister Margit had died. On the very day that the Allies were entering Auschwitz to liberate the prisoners, the remaining Nazis were so intent on killing Jews that instead of fleeing from their enemies, they stayed to randomly shoot and kill as many Jews as they could. My Aunt Margit was killed on the day of liberation. So now the story of how my mother and I survived. As I mentioned, my father was imprisoned in a forced labor camp. He had learned that the Nazi system for keeping track of the Jews involved putting Jews in ghettos closest to their official address. Although my mother had been living with her family in Nyíregyháza, her official address was still the Budapest apartment where she and my father had previously lived. When word reached my father that my mother had given birth and that we were imprisoned in a ghetto, he somehow managed to escape the labor camp. He headed straight to Nyíregyháza. With him, he had papers with the address of their Budapest apartment. The Jews in Budapest had not yet been rounded up. My father knew that he could buy time if he could get us there. He arrived at the ghetto when I was just a few days old. He immediately went to the office of the local authorities and presented the papers showing that my mother and I should officially be in Budapest. Predictably, he was turned down. So, he camped on the steps of the police station for days. When I was a little over a week old, miraculously, he was granted papers to take us to Budapest. My father wasted no time preparing to get us out of the ghetto. However, to his horror, my mother suddenly insisted on staying with her mother. My father had told her that, afraid to be found with us, he was going to turn himself in at the labor camp as soon as he got us to Budapest. So again, terrified of being alone, my mother refused to leave her mother. My grandmother literally pushed her out the door and locked it behind her. My father took us to Budapest and went back to the labor camp, where he died on March 8, 1945, just 2 months before the Allies liberated the camps. When our family boarded the train to Budapest, my mother was shocked to learn that her 19-year-old sister, Olga, had somehow also slipped out of the ghetto and was on the train. When they reached Budapest, my mother and Olga obtained Christian identity papers. They managed to get an apartment and for 2 months lived quietly and safely as 2 Christian women with a baby. On July 5, 1944, Olga left the apartment to get food. Just as she stepped out of the building, a former neighbor recognized her and yelled, "She's a Jew." Nearby soldiers immediately ran in her direction. Olga turned and ran back into the building with the soldiers close at her heels. I don't know what ran through the mind of my 19-year-old aunt. She must have realized that she had very few options, or none at all, that wouldn't lead the soldiers directly to my mother and me. So she made a fateful decision. My teenage aunt raced to the roof of the building and jumped. She died on a Budapest sidewalk on July 5th, 1944. My mother and I were never discovered. Immediately after Olga's death, my mother slipped out of the apartment building and spent the rest of the war years hiding. In April of 1945, Soviet troops drove the last German units and their Arrow Cross collaborators out of Hungary. I was exactly 1 year old. By the time the war ended, my entire family, except for my mother, had been murdered. I grew up with no father, grandparents, aunts, uncles, or cousins. However, I count myself blessed in many ways, and that would be a whole other story if we had the time. My mother remarried when I was 7, and I have 2 amazing brothers who have been my best friends for decades. I've been married to my husband for over 57 years. We have 2 sons and 1 granddaughter. We moved from California to Missouri recently to live near my granddaughter, her wonderful husband, and their 3 precious sons. I count my blessings every day and consider myself very lucky because I know, beyond a doubt, that every day we're on this earth is a miracle to be celebrated.
I was born August 29, 1930, in a city called Simleu, Romania. And when I was about 2 years old, we moved from Simleu to a small town called Dobra. And that's where my sister was born, Irene, and my brother was born, Henry. My father was strictly Orthodox, so was my mother. And in fact, so Orthodox that my father actually wanted me to wear sidelocks, payas. And that was not easy in a town where we were the only Jewish family. And when I went to school, many of the children taunted me and called me dirty Jew, and they would pull on my payas. As old as I am now, I still remember very well what was happening. It was very uncomfortable. In the early 1940s, the Hungarians came into this area of Romania, and they occupied this area. Right away, they started with the Jews. There was persecution, there was a lot of killing, there was Jews who traveled on trains. They would throw them off on the side of the tracks. And you heard all kinds of stories that was happening, that Jews were being attacked all the time. The trains came in with the boxcars, and they loaded approximately between 80 to 90 people on each boxcar. And all my family was on these trains. And once we arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau, everybody was forced out of the trains, and we were immediately separated, except my father, myself, and my cousin Irvin. We were together, and the rest of the family were the following day shoved into the gas chamber, and of course that was the end of them. And approximately 80% of my family perished at Auschwitz-Birkenau. There was always fear of death. There was nothing that would stop a German killing a Jew. It was legal. It didn't matter to them if you did not obey their order. There was no trial, there was no arrest or anything. They would shoot you on the spot. We were transferred from Dora to Bergen-Belsen. In Bergen-Belsen, when we arrived, we encountered nothing but dead bodies all over the camp. You couldn't walk 5 to 10 feet that you didn't encounter a dead body. And no food whatsoever. We were not given any food. The weeks went by, a whole month went by, and absolutely no food. So my cousin Irvin and me, we were just scavenging around the camp and walking around trying to see maybe we can find a potato or something to eat, because we didn't have a bite of food for weeks and weeks. And we come up to an area where we see something sticking out of the ground, and it looked like a hoof of a horse. And it wasn't that difficult to actually cut it off, because it was so rotted away that it just almost, just by picking it up, it separated. And we were very careful that other prisoners do not see what we were doing, because if they would have seen it, they would have attacked us and steal it from us. So we took back this horse and we made a little fire and we cooked it as long as we could. We ran out of wood, and we cooked the bone and we just drank what we called soup. And I believe that mentally it helped us, just thinking that we are eating something. I was liberated April 15, 1945 by the British Army. That we had no idea that we're going to be liberated, but that's what happened. At that day, the British arrived, and a whole bunch of tanks and half-tracks showed up on the other side of the fence. And within a couple of hours, they made a turn and just knocked the fence down. And they announced that, in many languages, by the way, including Yiddish, where most of us spoke very well Yiddish, and they announced that the Germans have nothing to say anymore in this camp, and we are liberated by the British Army. And needless to say, you would think that we would be happy and dance for joy, but we had no strength. We couldn't even get up from the ground. The following day, the British gave us, everybody, a loaf of bread that they have captured from the Wehrmacht, from the Germans. And sadly, many of the people who ate the bread, some of them ate the whole loaf of bread and just died from eating that bread. We thought it was poison, but we just couldn't tolerate the food. It took months and months before we were able to say, okay, we are free people. After a while, we wanted to leave the camp, and we did, and we moved to Frankfurt in Germany, where we started a little business. We started actually a little kosher butcher shop. We managed to build a building and slaughter 2 cows a week, because there was definitely a need for selling kosher meat. And as the situation was there, anything that had to do with food, you could be a success. My father had a sister and a brother in the United States. He was able to have contact with his sister. And of course, with the Congress passing the displaced people's quota in 1948, we were able to come to the United States, and actually we came by army boat. The name of the boat was Maryland Marlin, and it was full with ex-prisoners, and we arrived in New York Harbor at August 20, 1949, just before my 19th birthday. I met my wife, we got married, we had 4 sons, and we ended up with 8 grandchildren. And I can only tell you that I'm the happiest man alive, that I have a wonderful wife, wonderful children, 4 nice sons and daughter-in-laws, and 8 grandchildren. And God bless them all. This is worth everything.
Shalom, my name is Evital Shachar, and I'm a Shinshin here in St. Louis. A Shinshin is an 18-year-old emissary who volunteered in a Jewish community abroad. In the month of October and November 2019, I had the opportunity to participate in an Israeli delegation to Poland in order to learn firsthand about the horrors of the Holocaust. The following portion is an entry from my diary that I kept at the time. November 1st, 2019, Lublin, Poland. Arriving in Belzec, an abandoned and desolate place. This was a camp designed to be an extermination camp using gas. The Nazis rounded up all the Jews living in the area, from Lvov, Lublin, and other places. They used trains to bring the Jews straight to the entrance of the camp, to a fake train station set up by the Nazis. There were benches, a train platform, a window to buy tickets, flowers, music, and so on. After passing this fake station, they marched into a little camp. They were stripped off their clothes, dumped their belongings, split up into men and women, and began marching into a small examination cells. After about 20 minutes, not a single beating heart remained. My grandfather, Richard Levin, was born in Lvov, Poland, in 1942. His parents, Yulia and Leon Berkovich, were dentists. When Richard was only 3 months old, and after a pogrom in their town, they decided to escape. Unfortunately, the Nazis caught them and put them on a train. In a brave and unbelievable move, Richard's parents put my grandfather into a small suitcase, covered him with clothes, and put inside his documents. They closed the suitcase and threw it out of the moving train. One push that saved my grandfather's life. A family member also in the train managed to do the same, and they both survived the landing. The family member brought Richard to the partisans. Richard was taken to an orphanage inside a convent. Thus he grew up as a Christian until he was about 8 years old. When he turned 8, a couple that wanted to adopt a child came to the orphanage. This couple, Miriam and Eliezer, decided that they wanted to adopt a Jewish child, but not just a Jewish child, but the poorest, the weakest, and the sickest child. And that was my grandfather. Eliezer was the Deputy Minister of Construction and Housing of Polish government. Miriam was a Deputy Minister of Education. My grandfather never knew they were his adoptive parents. He thought they were his biological parents that had come to pick him up from the orphanage. My grandfather was sent to prestigious schools during the day, and in the afternoon was sent to piano classes. But he secretly ran away from piano lessons and went to the Zionist movement. When he turned 14, he came to his parents with a dramatic proposal. My grandfather told them that he is a Jew, and Jews must immigrate to Eretz Israel and build it. He was stubborn, and at the age of 14, he and his parents immigrated to Israel. Until my delegation trip to Poland in 2019, we did not know where my grandfather's biological parents were murdered, because there were no record of it. On my day at Belzec, I went through a spiritual journey that is hard to describe. I will tell briefly that following the supersensory experience I had, I found that there is 100% certainty that they were murdered in this very camp. Before I finish, I was in Belzec exactly 77 years after Yulia and Leon were murdered there. I had the honor of closing a 77-year-old circle. We shall never forget.
Schwester Chaya mit de grüne Augen, mein Schwester Chaya mit de schwarze Zähne. Die Schwester Chaya, was hat mich der Zeugen, auf smutsche Gassen heut mit krummen Treff. Die Mama ist weg von Sturmwagen, bin auf in Himmel hat echt kaum gehört. Sie ist weg in Krummerheim verdienen, das mit ne drobne Grosche die Geld. Und ist geblieben mit den Brüdern, und sie hat gekommen und gehört. Und sie pflegt singen sie die schönen Lieder, von Nacht, wenn kleine Kinder werden mir. Mein Schwester Chaya mit den grünen Augen, mein Schwester Chaya mit den langen Haaren. Die Schwester Chaya, was hat mich der Zeugen, ist noch nicht abgewinnt, kein Jahr. Sie hat geräumt, gekocht, erlangt das Essen. Sie hat gezwungen uns die kleine Kerl. Nur spielen sich mit uns hat sie vergessen. Die Schwester Chaya mit die schwarze Zepp. Mein Schwester Chaya mit die Augen grüne, Deutsch hat in Treblinka sie verbrennt. Und ich bin in der jüdische Medine, das allerletzte, was hat sie gekannt. Für ich schreibe ich auf Jiddisch meine Lieder, in Tag die schreckliche von unserer Zeit. Bei Gott alleine sie was Jachide, in Himmel sitzt sie bei seiner rechten Seite. Für ich schreibe ich auf Jiddisch meine Lieder, in Tag die schreckliche von unserer Zeit. Bei Gott alleine sie was Jachide, in Himmel sitzt sie bei seiner rechten Seite.
In memory of the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust, survivors from our community will light 6 memorial candles. From the community's earliest Yom HaShoah commemorations, the first candle had always been lit by Sara Wolf. Though Sara and her beloved husband Leo have both passed away, the creation of the Holocaust Museum in St. Louis was the fulfillment of their shared vision. Sara and Leo passed their legacy of remembrance on to the next generation of the family. Today, the candle is being lit by the Wolf's granddaughter, Lauren, accompanied by Leslie Wolf, her daughter, Taylor, and her son, Cameron. The next candle will be lit by Rachel Miller. After the German occupation of Paris and the murder of her father, Rachel's mother sent her to the countryside to be cared for by a non-Jewish friend. Now Rachel's name would be Christine. Her beloved sister, Sabine, was supposed to join her, but she and her mother were rounded up and murdered in Auschwitz. Her 2 brothers joined the resistance. They too did not survive. After liberation, Rachel immigrated to the United States in 1946 and lived in 5 different foster homes. Rachel has been sharing her testimony at our Holocaust Museum and around the country for many years. The next candle will be lit by Mendel Rosenberg. Mendel was born in 1928 and grew up in Šiauliai, Lithuania. His father was murdered by a mobile killing squad in 1941. Mendel was in several concentration camps from the age of 13 to 16. After the war, he was reunited with his mother, but he found out his brother had been murdered in February 1945. After coming to America, Mendel served in the U.S. Army in Korea, 1951 to 1952. Mendel did not speak about his experiences for 35 years. He now speaks at the Holocaust Museum and all over the country. The next candle will be lit by Felicia Wirtz. Felicia Smolarczyk-Wirtz was born in Wyszków, Poland in 1937. When the war broke out, Felicia and her family fled east to the Russian border. Her father died on the Eastern Front, and her mother died in a Russian labor camp. Felicia spent the war years in several orphanages in Russia. After the war, Felicia was sent to a Jewish orphanage in Lodz, Poland, and immigrated to the United States in 1966. Eventually, she settled in St. Louis, where she was employed by the JCC, assisting new immigrants from the Soviet Union. She has also been very active in our oral history project, interviewing Russian survivors in their native language. The fifth candle is being lit by Oscar Jacob, accompanied by his wife Margot. The sixth candle is being lit by Erica Schwartz, accompanied by her husband, Bill. The Talmud teaches us that whoever saves a single life, it is as if one saves the entire world. Yet the number of rescuers who helped Jews during the Holocaust is shockingly small. Therefore, it is important to recognize the righteous among the nations who risked or even sacrificed their own lives by rescuing Jewish people. In remembrance of these righteous souls, we lay a rose alongside our memorial candles. This year, the rose will be placed by Dr. David Oughton. As an educator, David has been involved at the Holocaust Museum from before the museum's founding to the present day. With the museum's founding director, Rabbi Robert Sternberg, he authored Jewish-Christian Relations in Light of the Holocaust. David has served as president of the board of Interfaith Partnership of Greater St. Louis, and he is a retired professor of world religions at St. Louis University. While acknowledging the effects of the Holocaust on the Jewish people, we can't be blind to the tragedies and genocides stemming from intolerance and hatred that preceded the Holocaust and continue until today. We light a seventh candle in remembrance of the victims of violence and indifference. Today, that candle will be lit by Karen Oresti, Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League, Heartland, for over 20 years. Karen leaves a substantial legacy of civil rights advocacy, innovations in education, and long-standing community partnerships, several with the Kaplan-Feldman Holocaust Museum, most notably law enforcement and society. Let us pray that the light of this candle, together with our 6 memorial candles, will inspire us all to take action to make a better, more peaceful world. The flame of remembrance symbolizes the sacred obligation of the second and third generation children and grandchildren of survivors, to carry on the legacy of Holocaust remembrance. This year, the flame will be lit by Stephen Goldsmith, accompanied by his wife Lexi. Several years ago, Steve began sharing the testimony of his father, Gunter Goldsmith, of blessed memory. Gunter enthralled audiences with his story of escaping Nazi Germany in 1941, only to return to Germany in 1945 as a U.S. Army paratrooper. Steve keeps that story alive. He is also a member of the St. Louis Survivors and Descendants group.
And now our Chazan, Sharon Nathanson, will lead us in the quintessential memorial prayer, El Maleh Rachamim.
El Maleh Rachamim, Shochein B'Amramim, Hamtzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei HaShechina, B'ma'alot Kedoshim U'Toharim Gezohar Hagia Mazirim L'nishmat Kol Acheinu B'nei Yisrael Shenitbechu b'Shoah, Hanashim Nashim V'Taf Shenechneku V'Shenisrafu V'Shenehergu Shemasru et nafsham al Kiddush Hashem B'Gan Eden Dei Menuchatam. Anna Ba'al Harachamim Hasirim B'Sitek Nafecha Le'olamim Utzror B'Yitzror HaChayim Et Nishmotehem
El Maleh Rachamim, exalted, compassionate God, we pray that you'll grant perfect peace in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure, to the souls of our beloved brethren, men, women, and children of the house of Israel, who were slaughtered and suffocated and burned to ash. May their memories endure, inspiring truth and loyalty in our lives. May their neshamot, their souls, thus be bound up in the bond of life eternal. God is their portion. May they always rest in peace. And let us all say together, Amen. And now, Harvey and Michael Wolf will lead us in the recitation of the mourners' Kaddish.
Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei Rabba, v'yalma devra chirutei, v'chamlich malchutei, v'chayechon u'vyomechon, u'v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agalah u'zmin koriv v'imaru. Amen. Yehei shmei Rabba min barach le'olam amayaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yisba'ar v'yitroman v'yitnaseh v'yishadar v'yishaleh v'yishalal shemei dekudashah b'rechu. Leila min chol berchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata da'amaran v'alma v'imru. Amen. Yehei shloma Rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu v'kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom v'imramav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'Kol Kol Yisrael V'Yimeru. Amen.
We mourn for the 6 million of our people brutally destroyed by civilized men behaving like savages. The cruelties of Pharaoh, Haman, Nebuchadnezzar, and Titus cannot be compared to the diabolical schemes of the modern tyrants in their design to exterminate an entire people. The blood of the innocent who perished in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, Treblinka, and Theresienstadt cry out to both God and humanity. We will never forget the burning of the synagogues and Batei Midrash, houses of study, the destruction of Sifrei Kodesh, holy books, and the scrolls of our Torah, the sadistic torment and murder of scholars, sages, and teachers. They tortured the flesh of our brothers and sisters, but they could not crush their spirit, their faith, and their love. We recall our brothers and sisters in the Warsaw Ghetto and elsewhere who valiantly defied the monstrous Nazis. And we recall the heroism of those who, in the face of unprecedented and overwhelming force, maintained culture and asserted Jewish values, even in the midst of enslavement and destruction. Let us pray, therefore, Adonai, our God, remember our martyred children, remember all who have given their lives to sanctify God's holy name. Even as we mourn, we recall the compassionate men and women of all faiths and nationalities who, at the peril of their own lives, saved some of our people. Truly, the righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come. Let us pray and work for the day when there will be no more hatred and no more violence. Lo yisa goy el goy cherev, velo yilmedu od milchama. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn of war anymore. And let us all say together, Amen. In just a moment, we will hear the partisan song, followed by Hatikva and the national anthem of our country, the United States. And our program will conclude, as it began, with the blast of the shofar.
Shalom. My name is Dana Koren, and I'm the Shinshinit. Today, I will sing the partisan song. In my kibbutz, Kibbutz Kfar Upin, every Yom HaShoah ceremony, we sing that song in Hebrew at the end, all together. In my kibbutz, there are many Holocaust survivors, and while we are singing it, it's so powerful and meaningful. It means a lot to me to sing that song today. אל נא תאמר הנה דרכי האחרונה, את אור היום הסתירו שמי העננה, זה יום נחשפנו לו עוד יעל ויבוא, ומצעדינו עוד יראים אנחנו פה. זה יום נחשפנו לו עוד יעל ויבוא, ומצעדינו עוד יראים אנחנו פה. מארץ התמר עד ירכתי כפורים, אנחנו פה במחובות וייסורים, ובאשר טיפה דמנו שם נגרע, הלא ינוב עוד עוז רוחנו בגבורה. ובאשר טיפה דמנו שם נגרע, הלא ינוב עוד עוז רוחנו בגבורה.
Shalom, my name is Gilad Helbat Sofer and I'm one of the Shinshinim in St. Louis. You may stand and join me, the Shinshinim, and the Israeli Scouts to sing Hatikva, the Israeli anthem.
כל עוד בלבב פנימה, נפש יהודי צומיה, ולפתה מזרח קדימה, עין לציון צופיה, עוד לא עבדה תקוותנו, התקווה בשנות 2000, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון וירושלים. להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון וירושלים.